Before he ever stepped onto a television set, Jim Nabors was just a small-town kid with a dream and a voice that didn't quite match his surroundings. Born in 1930s Alabama, he grew up surrounded by the slow drawl of the South and the rigid expectations of a deeply conservative community. Nabors wasn't the athletic type. He had severe asthma as a child, which meant he spent more time indoors, watching the world pass by from a distance. That distance may have shaped the sharp emotional sensitivity he'd later bring to his performances, and it gave him time to develop a voice that would shock anyone who heard it. See, Nabors wasn't just a goofy guy from the later TV years. He had this operatic baritone that could stop people in their tracks. It was almost absurd hearing such a powerful, rich voice come out of someone who looked and sounded like the shyest, most humble man on earth. That contrast would become part of his charm. But his real rise to fame started in the most unexpected place, a nightclub in Santa Monica. He was working at the front desk of a television station during the day, just trying to pay rent, and performing in local clubs at night when he caught the attention of Andy Griffith. At the time, Griffith was already a well-known name in the television world. He saw something unique in Jim, not just comedic timing, but heart, and that's when things changed almost overnight. Griffith brought Nabors on for what was supposed to be a one-episode role on The Andy Griffith Show, playing a bumbling but lovable gas station attendant named Gomer Pyle. The character was written to be a joke, but Jim's performance turned into something unforgettable. People loved him. Audiences couldn't get enough of that wide-eyed innocence, that awkward charm, and that unforgettable golly. Gomer Pyle quickly became a recurring character, and then the star of his own spin-off, Gomer Pyle, USMC. It was an instant hit. Nabors skyrocketed to fame, becoming a household name across America. He represented something wholesome and simple in a time when the country was going through massive social changes. He felt safe, family-friendly, clean-cut, but behind all that, Jim Nabors was carrying a secret, a part of himself that couldn't be revealed in 1960s Hollywood. Not if he wanted to keep working, not if he wanted to stay safe. While the world saw a lovable goofball in a military uniform, Jim Nabors was living a double life, carefully navigating a town that praised him in public but could destroy him if the wrong truth ever came out. The fame was real, the success was real, but so was the fear, and that fear would follow him for decades. But fame in Hollywood has a way of magnifying everything, including secrets. Long before Hollywood lights ever touched his face, Jim Nabors knew he was different. And not just because of his voice or the way he preferred art and music over sports. Growing up in the Deep South during the 1940s and 50s, being gay wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. Even admitting it to yourself came with a quiet kind of fear that seeped into every part of your life. Jim carried that burden from a young age, and it shaped how he moved through the world. There were no role models, no open conversations, and certainly no safe spaces. If you were different, you stayed silent. You learned to smile, deflect, perform. And Jim did exactly that. He was warm, gentle, and friendly to everyone, easy to love, but hard to know. That quiet armor would serve him well in Hollywood, where the pressures of fame could either hide you or expose you, depending on how you played the game. Once he became a star, there were whispers. You couldn't be in the public eye and live with a private life forever, not in a town built on rumors. But Jim was careful, very careful. He kept his personal life completely off the radar, never making public appearances with dates, never slipping up in interviews, never getting caught in compromising photos. Behind closed doors, he had a trusted circle of friends who knew the truth. In private, he could be himself. But even then, it came with caution. One wrong word could end everything. It wasn't about shame, it was about survival. At the time, actors could lose their entire careers for being suspected of homosexuality. Studios had morality clauses. Fan magazines would spin scandals from nothing. Even a close friendship with another man could spark headlines. So Jim walked the line quietly, building a reputation as a kind-hearted, almost bashful figure with a golden voice and a good soul. The public adored him. but they didn't really know him. In his off time, Jim wasn't out partying or seeking attention. He preferred small gatherings, dinners with close friends, time at home. He understood the stakes. Fame gave him a platform, but it also painted a target on his back. Every move was watched. Every word could be twisted. And for someone with as much to lose as Jim Nabors, staying quiet felt like the only option. Still, in certain circles, especially in Hollywood's underground queer community, Jim was seen as someone quietly living in truth. Not loudly, not publicly, but with dignity. He didn't hide who he was from those who mattered, but he also didn't broadcast it because the world wasn't ready. And then the whispers turned into something louder, something bigger, a rumor that would follow him for the rest of his life. In early 1971, a rumor exploded across Hollywood and had Jim Nabors' name all over it. According to the whispers, he had secretly married one of the most iconic heartthrobs in movie history, Rock Hudson. The idea was wild, unbelievable to some, and dangerously plausible to others. Two of the most recognizable men in America, allegedly tying a knot in a private ceremony? It didn't matter that it wasn't true. In Hollywood, rumors have a way of becoming reality if they're juicy enough. The whole thing started as a joke, a cruel one. Some say it began with a group of friends who thought it'd be funny to send out fake invitations to a wedding between Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors. But the pranks spiraled fast. What was supposed to be an inside gag became a wildfire. Within days, the tabloids picked it up. Headlines screamed about a secret union. People whispered about what it meant. Was it real? Were these two leading men actually living a double life together? For Jim Nabors, it was a nightmare. He was still riding the wave of mainstream success, beloved for his wholesome image, and now suddenly entangled in one of the most talked about rumors of the decade. And Rock Hudson, who was still chasing leading man roles, had just as much, if not more, to lose. Both men denied the story. Both distanced themselves from the headlines. But the damage was done. The truth? Jim and Rock were friendly. They'd run in the same Hollywood circles, like many closeted stars did, finding quiet support in private settings. But they were never romantically involved. Still, once a rumor takes hold, especially one that touches a nerve the public isn't ready to talk about, it can leave scars. For Jim, the fallout meant more than just embarrassment. It changed his behavior completely. From that moment on, Jim pulled back. He became even more private, even more guarded. He stopped being seen with certain people, stopped going to events where whispers might start again. The rumor may have been false, but the risk it revealed was real. Even the idea of being associated with another gay man could ruin everything. And perhaps the saddest part? That ridiculous, fake wedding gag effectively ended Jim's friendship with Rock Hudson. They never spoke publicly again. What had once been a quiet, respectful connection between two men living careful lives was erased because of a joke that went too far. But Hollywood has always had a double standard. While the studios churned out romance films and picture-perfect leading men, some of those very stars were living in fear behind the scenes. Jim Nabors got caught in the crossfire of a culture that demanded perfection but punished truth. And in the wake of that rumor, Jim made a decision: disappear from the spotlight before it burned him alive. After the rumor with Rock Hudson spread like wildfire, Jim Nabors was never quite the same in public. His smile was still warm, his performances still polished, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The sense of ease, of comfort in the spotlight faded. It wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about survival. Hollywood had shown him just how fragile a reputation could be, especially when your private life didn't align with the image America expected. Behind the scenes, Jim felt the walls close in, even though he continued to work, hosting his own variety show, appearing on specials, and releasing music. There was a noticeable pullback from the kind of spotlight that once embraced him. He became more selective, more distant from the Hollywood social scene. The glitz and glam had turned sour. He wasn't bitter, but he was wary. Fame had opened doors, But now it also felt like a trap. And who could blame him? He'd worked his way up from anonymity to national stardom without relying on scandal or controversy. But in just one wave of gossip, the public was suddenly more interested in who he might be sleeping with than in his actual work. It was a betrayal of sorts, the kind that makes you question who's really watching and why. Jim made the quiet choice to retreat. He bought a home in Hawaii, a place far removed from the flashing cameras and endless speculation. It wasn't just a vacation house. It was a safe haven. There he could breathe again. There he could exist without always looking over his shoulder. The move didn't end his career, but it certainly marked a shift in how he chose to live it. He focused more on live performances and television appearances that kept him under less scrutiny. He didn't disappear entirely, but he pulled back the curtain just enough to protect what mattered most: his peace. During this time, he rarely addressed the rumors. He didn't launch legal battles. He didn't lash out in interviews. He just let it fade, knowing that in time, the public would lose interest. And they did. But Jim never forgot how quickly it all unraveled, and how easily it could happen again. The industry still loved his talent. He had one of the most beautiful voices on television and a natural warmth that made audiences feel like he was family. But behind the scenes, he was done playing Hollywood's games. He wouldn't lie, but he wouldn't offer up the truth either. Not while the cost was still so high. Still, even in his quiet, carefully constructed life, something unexpected was waiting. A connection, a relationship, a kind of love that didn't need to be shouted from rooftops to be real. And when Jim met him, everything started to change. Some people spend their whole lives chasing fame. Others spend it chasing something quieter, something stronger: love. Jim Nabors had already tasted stardom by the time he met Stan Cadwallader in the mid-1970s. The world knew Jim as Gomer Pyle, the cheerful gas station attendant turned Marine, with a voice that could make even the toughest critics stop and listen. But Stan saw something else: someone real, someone private, someone who needed more than applause. Stan wasn't in the entertainment business. He was a firefighter in Honolulu when they met. No red carpets, no headlines, just a grounded, kind-hearted man who treated Jim like a person, not a persona. That's what drew Jim in. After years of guarding himself, constantly scanning the room for people who might expose him, Stan offered something rare: safety. They connected almost instantly, and from there, a quiet love story began to unfold, away from the cameras, away from the noise. Their relationship was never about being seen. They traveled together, spent time at Jim's home in Hawaii, and built a life centered around trust and privacy. For nearly 4 decades, they were inseparable. Friends close to the couple often said they complemented each other perfectly. Jim, warm and soft-spoken, and Stan, calm and steady. Together, they created a rhythm that worked, one that didn't require explanation or validation from the outside world. But make no mistake, this was a real partnership. Stan wasn't just a companion. He was Jim's protector, his confidant, his chosen family. While Jim continued to perform and make appearances, Stan was always there in the background, a steady presence who helped him navigate the pressures of fame without losing himself. Their bond wasn't loud or flashy, but it was lasting. And in Hollywood, that alone was a miracle. For decades, the two kept their relationship quiet, not because they were ashamed, but because the world still wasn't ready. The fear of losing everything still lingered. Even as times began to shift and public opinion started to soften, Jim stayed private. He believed in keeping his personal life sacred, especially after what had happened with the Rock Hudson rumors. But love like that doesn't stay hidden forever. And as Jim entered his 80s, something changed. The world was finally catching up. Same-sex marriage had become legal in more places. Conversations around identity were shifting. And Jim, who had spent most of his life guarding a secret, made a decision. He was going to make it official. Not for the press, not for validation, but for Stan, for the man who had stood by him through everything. After nearly 40 years together, Jim was ready to let the world know who had truly been by his side all along. What he did next shocked his fans and broke one of Hollywood's longest silences. On January 15th, 2013, after nearly 4 decades together, Jim Nabors quietly did something no one saw coming. He married Stan Cadwallader. No press conference, no public announcement, just a simple private ceremony in a Seattle hotel room, days after Washington state had legalized same-sex marriage. It was intimate, quiet, and deeply personal, just like their entire relationship had always been. The news didn't break until later, when Jim confirmed it himself in a rare interview. And when he did, fans were stunned. Not because they judge him, but because after all these years, Jim Nabors had finally confirmed what so many had suspected but never dared ask. He had spent most of his life in love with a man, and it wasn't a rumor. It was real. For years, Jim had deflected questions about his personal life with grace. He'd avoided the scandal, kept his dignity, and never allowed tabloids to define him. And now, in the final chapters of his life, he was ready to speak his truth, not for attention, but for love. He said he simply wanted to formalize a relationship and secure legal protections for the man he loved. There was no agenda, no fanfare, just honesty. I'm not ashamed of people knowing. It's just that it was such a personal thing. I didn't tell anybody, Jim said in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. It wasn't a coming-out spectacle. It wasn't a campaign. It was a quiet moment of clarity. And that made it even more powerful. The reaction from fans was overwhelmingly supportive. People didn't turn on him. They didn't cancel him. In fact, many celebrated him for finally sharing a side of himself that had been hidden for so long, and for doing it on his terms. Jim Nabors didn't let Hollywood define him. He didn't let fear or gossip steal his identity. He waited until the world caught up, until it was safe. For some, the wedding felt like a happy ending. But for Jim and Stan, it wasn't an ending at all. It was simply a continuation of the life they'd already built, now with a little more freedom. After the ceremony, they returned to Hawaii, back to the quiet home they loved, away from the noise, away from the spotlight. And that's where Jim spent his final years. Not in hiding, not in fear, but in peace. The man once tangled in the most persistent gay rumor in Hollywood had now spoken the truth himself, publicly, proudly, and with love. No script, no performance, just Jim. But while the world now knew the truth, there was still one final chapter, one that revealed just how much Jim had shaped his legacy behind the scenes. By the time Jim Nabors passed away in 2017, he had lived a life that few in Hollywood could claim, one built on talent, integrity, and a quiet kind of bravery. He didn't make headlines for scandals. He didn't chase controversy. But beneath the surface of his cheerful, almost cartoonish public image was a man who had carefully navigated one of the most unforgiving industries in the world, while holding on to a secret that could have ended everything. And yet, that secret never defined him. What defined Jim was the joy he brought into people's lives, the voice that soared unexpectedly from a goofy southern drawl into rich baritone ballads, the innocence of Gomer Pyle, a character so loved that it outlived the show itself. And most of all, the way he stayed grounded through it all, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Jim didn't live to make a statement, but in the end, he made one anyway, not through interviews or memoirs, but through his actions, through the way he loved Stan Cadwallader, quietly and consistently, for nearly 40 years, through the way he waited until the time was right to speak his truth, even if that meant decades of silence, and through the dignity with which he refused to let the world's expectations shape his identity. When the news of his death broke, tributes poured in from fellow actors, fans, even military veterans who had grown up watching Gomer Pyle, USMC, and felt a deep connection to the character he portrayed. But among all the praise, there was something different this time, an added layer of respect, not just for his work, but for the life he led in private, for the love he protected, for the path he walked without ever turning bitter or resentful. Jim never became an activist, but his story inspired people in a different way. He proved that you could live authentically, even if it meant waiting for the right moment. He showed that strength doesn't always look like protest signs or microphones. Sometimes it's just staying true to yourself when the world tells you not to. Today, his legacy isn't just about television reruns or classic songs. It's about resilience, about the quiet courage it takes to survive in a place that doesn't always welcome difference. It's about the power of choosing love over fear, even when that love has to stay in the shadows for a while. Jim Nabors didn't need to shout his truth from the rooftops. In the end, he let it speak for itself. And when it finally did, it wasn't scandalous, it was beautiful. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered behind closed doors until the world is finally ready to hear them. Jim Nabors lived a life that defied the spotlight, even while standing in it. His story isn't just about Hollywood fame. It's about the quiet strength to be yourself when the world tells you not to. And sometimes the most unforgettable truths come from the people we thought we already knew. If this story gave you a new perspective on Jim Nabors, or just made you think twice about what happened behind the scenes in Hollywood, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more untold stories and deep dives into the lives of the stars you thought you knew. Thanks for watching and stay curious.